Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, April 6th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. As the week begins, we're taking a first look at the President's 2027 budget, starting with the headlines and then focusing on what they tell us about federal resources and capacity. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the budget landed on Capitol Hill last week, but left plenty of unanswered questions. We'll take a closer look at how Congress is navigating the budget moment. Plus, year after year, the same financial weaknesses keep showing up in the government's books. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The odds are not in federal employees' favor for getting a pay raise next year. The White House's budget request does not include any mention of a 2027 pay raise for civilian workers. That's in contrast with a proposed raise of up to 7% for military members. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman joins me now with more detail. Drew, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
The president's 2027 budget hit the Hill last Friday. I know you've been studying it. What's in or not in the budget proposal for the federal civilian workforce?
The most important thing here for civilian federal employees, if they're looking for any context clues on their pay raise prospects for next year here, is what's not mentioned in the budget request. There is no money set aside, nothing ever mentioned about a civilian federal employee pay raise next year. And we know that it's missing in part with the context of this being included for military members, where they're going to see roughly a 5 to 7% raise if that budget request becomes enacted. And it was confirmed by an Office of Management and Budget spokesperson that no civilian pay raise is being included in the budget request. That doesn't necessarily mean that federal employees won't get a pay raise next year, but it certainly slims their chances of seeing that salary increase. And just for context, federal employees saw their smallest pay raise, annual pay raise this year with 1% for 2026. That's the smallest since 2021. So in the last 5 years, some federal employees, those in law enforcement positions and military members, got a larger 3.8% pay raise next year. So that's kind of where we sit today with all of this.
What normally comes next in the pay raise process?
There's a lot of time for things to change, potentially. Nothing is necessarily impossible here. The next steps are generally that the president will have an alternative pay plan, most likely by the end of August. This happens every year across both Republican and Democratic administrations. Presidents issue what's called an alternative pay plan for a federal pay raise, and this is effectively to avoid what would be a default to a much larger 20% plus pay raise. Normally, presidents go with just a couple of percentage points for the annual increase. That's exactly what we saw happen last year, where there was no civilian pay raise mentioned in the budget request. And then President Trump, at the end of August, issued his pay plan of 1% for most civilian employees, and then exceptions being made for law enforcement personnel again. There's also still time for Congress to potentially intervene on this topic. You know, this doesn't often come up in annual appropriations, but because they are the ultimate deciders on appropriations for agencies, it's possible they could choose some sort of alternative plan themselves that could make its way into annual spending legislation. There's also the FAIR Act being proposed from House Democrats, where they're looking for a 4.1% federal pay raise next year. That's probably not as likely to occur. But all this being said, nothing is truly going to be made final until most likely December, when we'll see a potential executive order from the president on this.
That's really helpful in walking through all of that process. As you were reviewing the document, what else struck you? What else stood out?
Well, one thing that does seem to be a trend here is, as we know, there's a large military budget being proposed. It's the largest in decades that's coming from the Trump administration here. And that sort of disparity, when you take it in the context of also there being a general 10% cut to civilian agencies for the next fiscal year, that trend where you have increased military spending, decreased civilian spending being proposed, that seems to align generally as well with what we're seeing for the pay raise prospects, where you have a large pay raise coming for military members and nothing being said on the civilian side. I did find that trend interesting throughout the budget request here as well.
And Drew, you mentioned that 10% reduction on the civilian agency side of the budget. Does the budget say anything about future plans for federal employee staffing levels?
It does speak somewhat to the Trump administration's push for the last 14 or so months to downsize the federal workforce. They wrote in the budget request that they have made significant progress with more than 300,000 federal employees leaving their jobs in 2025, seeing even more leave their jobs in the early months of 2026 as well. So the White House is, pointing to that being a continued priority, although we don't necessarily know the details of perhaps how much further they're going to reduce staffing, whether some agencies might turn around and start hiring, which we've seen a bit of a trend on as well. So more of those details are yet to be made clear, but we've seen some data from the budget request shows the staffing level decreases across most agencies between 2024 to 2025. There's also some estimates of agency headcounts for 2026 and into 2027. Those include staffing increases at some agencies like Department of Justice, Veterans Affairs, DHS had some staffing increases as well. But even if agencies did go on that projected trend there, it's still going to, it seems, largely remain below 2024 staffing levels at the very least.
Well, this is really the opening act of this play, so we'll wait to see how all of those discussions play out. That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.